Experts restored this 1860 image and discovered the secret the family was hiding. The package arrived at the Boston Heritage Restoration Center on a cold March morning, wrapped in layers of protective cloth and accompanied by a handwritten note. Sarah Mitchell, a senior photograph conservator with 15 years of experience, carefully unwrapped the contents at her workstation. Inside lay a daguerreotype from 1860, its silver-plated surface tarnished and obscured by decades of oxidation and neglect. The note explained that the photograph had been discovered in an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina. The current owner, a woman named Rebecca Turner, had inherited a box of family documents and wanted the image restored before donating it to a local historical society. The daguerreotype showed what appeared to be a prosperous merchant family. A stern-looking man in his 40s, a woman in an elaborate dress, and 3 children arranged formally in front of a painted backdrop. Sarah placed the daguerreotype under her magnifying lamp and examined it closely. The technique used to create the image was typical of the period, but something about the composition caught her attention. The man's posture seemed stiff, almost defensive, and his eyes held an intensity that transcended the usual solemnity of early photography. She noticed his hand rested on a leather-bound book, positioned prominently in the frame. The restoration center hummed with quiet activity around her. Colleagues worked at adjacent stations, carefully preserving documents and photographs that chronicled American history. Sarah had restored hundreds of daguerreotypes over the years, each one offering a window into the past. But this particular image stirred something different within her, an instinct honed by years of experience that told her there was more to this photograph than met the eye. As Sarah began documenting the daguerreotype's condition, she felt the familiar pull of curiosity that had drawn her to this profession. Every photograph told a story, but some held secrets that only revealed themselves through careful examination and restoration. This one, she sensed, might be different from the countless images she had restored over the years. The way the family members were positioned, the careful formality of their poses, and especially that book in the patriarch's hand, everything seemed deliberate, calculated. She took preliminary photographs of the daguerreotype from multiple angles, noting areas where the silver surface had degraded and where tarnish obscured details. The work ahead would be delicate and time-consuming, requiring patience and precision. But Sarah thrived on such challenges. She picked up her phone and called Rebecca Turner, hoping to learn more about the family in the photograph. The conversation would be brief, but it would set in motion an investigation that would ultimately reveal one of the most extraordinary untold stories of the abolitionist movement, hidden in plain sight for more than a century and a half. Rebecca Turner answered on the third ring, her voice warm but cautious. She explained that she knew very little about the family in the photograph. Her late husband had been a distant relative of the people pictured, but family records had been scattered or lost during the Civil War and its aftermath. The only name she could provide was William Harrison, the patriarch who had owned a textile importing business in Charleston during the 1850s. "My husband never talked much about his Charleston ancestors," Rebecca admitted. "I think there was some family shame involved, maybe about losing everything during the war. You know how Southern families can be about those things, so much pride tied up in the past." Sarah thanked her and began her research. She started with census records, shipping manifests, and business directories from Charleston in 1860. William Harrison appeared in multiple documents as a successful merchant who imported cotton and tobacco. His business seemed legitimate and prosperous, with no obvious connection to anything controversial. The records showed he owned a warehouse near the Charleston docks and employed several workers. But as Sarah continued the restoration process over the following days, something unexpected emerged. Using specialized lighting techniques and digital enhancement software, she noticed faint markings on the spine of the book William held in the photograph. The oxidation had obscured them almost completely, but with careful work she could make out what appeared to be letters. FD, followed by what might have been a date. Sarah's heart quickened. In abolitionist circles, those initials were legendary. Frederick Douglass had published his autobiography in 1845, and subsequent editions had become symbols of the anti-slavery movement. But possessing such a book in Charleston in 1860 would have been dangerous, possibly even illegal under local ordinances designed to suppress abolitionist literature. She leaned closer to her monitor, studying every pixel of the enhanced image. If William Harrison had deliberately posed with this book, he was sending a message. But to whom? And why would a Charleston merchant risk everything to be photographed with evidence of anti-slavery sympathies? The political climate in Charleston in 1860 had been explosive, with tensions between North and South reaching a breaking point. Sarah spent the evening researching laws regarding abolitionist materials in South Carolina. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Possession of anti-slavery literature could result in fines, imprisonment, or worse. Vigilante groups had attacked suspected abolitionists, and the social consequences of even minor anti-slavery sympathies could destroy a business and a family's reputation. She knew she needed expert help. She reached out to Dr. Marcus Thompson, a historian at Boston University who specialized in the Underground Railroad and abolitionist networks in the South. His response came within hours. He would visit the Restoration Center as soon as possible. Dr. Marcus Thompson arrived at the Restoration Center 2 days later, his weathered leather briefcase filled with research materials. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp, inquisitive eyes that had spent decades searching through archives for forgotten stories. Sarah showed him the enhanced images on her computer screen, pointing out the faint initials on the book spine. Marcus leaned forward, his breath catching slightly. "This is remarkable," he whispered. He pulled out a magnifying glass from his briefcase, examining the printed copy Sarah had prepared. "If this is what I think it is, we're looking at something extraordinary." He explained that Charleston in 1860 was one of the most dangerous places in America for anyone with anti-slavery sympathies. The city was a stronghold of pro-slavery ideology, and tensions were escalating rapidly in the months before the Civil War. The election of Abraham Lincoln that November would trigger South Carolina's secession just weeks later. Possessing abolitionist literature could result in arrest, violence, or worse. For a merchant to be photographed with such evidence seemed almost suicidal. Unless, Marcus said slowly, he was documenting something deliberately, something he wanted remembered, even if he couldn't speak about it openly. Sarah pulled up additional enhancements she had made. In the background of the photograph, barely visible through the painted backdrop, there appeared to be actual architectural details. Perhaps the photographer had positioned the family near a window or doorway. Marcus studied these carefully, noting what looked like wooden beams and a brick wall pattern. "Can you enhance this section more?" he asked, pointing to a corner of the image where shadows suggested depth beyond the painted scene. As Sarah worked, Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a worn journal filled with his handwritten notes and sketches. "I've been researching Charleston's Underground Railroad connections for 20 years, he explained. "Most historians believe the network barely existed in South Carolina, that it was too dangerous. But I've found fragments of evidence suggesting otherwise. Coded letters, unexplained property transfers, testimony from formerly enslaved people who claimed they received help escaping from Charleston itself. The historical consensus held that the Underground Railroad operated primarily in border states and the North, where geographical proximity to free territory made escapes more feasible. But Marcus had always suspected that even in the heart of the Confederacy, there were brave individuals willing to help. The enhanced image loaded on the screen, and both of them fell silent. What they saw would change everything they thought they knew about the Harrison family. The enhanced background revealed something neither Sarah nor Marcus had expected. Carved into the wooden beam behind the family was a symbol, a simple star with 5 points, surrounded by what appeared to be a compass rose. The carving was subtle, weathered, but unmistakable once they knew to look for it. The star pointed distinctly northward. Marcus pulled out his journal and flipped through pages of sketches and notes with trembling hands. His decades of research suddenly crystallized around this single image. "Here," he said, showing Sarah a drawing he had made years ago from a description given by a formerly enslaved woman named Hannah Price in an 1882 interview. She said the people who helped her escape from Charleston marked their safe house with a star that showed the way north. I always thought it was metaphorical, just poetic language describing hope or freedom. Sarah stared at the comparison. The symbols matched perfectly. 5 points, compass rose, the same weathered appearance that suggested age and deliberate concealment. They spent the next several hours examining every detail of the photograph with renewed intensity. Marcus explained that safe houses for the Underground Railroad often used subtle signals, particular curtain arrangements, specific paint colors, or architectural features that could be recognized by those who knew what to look for. The star symbol would have been invisible to most people, just another decorative element in a merchant's home or business. But to someone desperate for freedom, someone who had been told what to search for, it would have been a beacon of hope. "But why photograph it?" Sarah asked, her mind racing through possibilities. "Why create permanent evidence that could destroy him and his entire family?" Marcus considered this carefully, his historian's mind weighing motivations and consequences. Daguerreotypes in 1860 were expensive, formal occasions. Families commissioned them to commemorate important moments or to leave a legacy. Perhaps William knew what was coming: the war, the chaos, the possibility he might not survive. Maybe he wanted someone someday to know the truth about what he had done. Or perhaps he intended this photograph to reach someone specific, someone in the North who would understand its significance. Sarah turned back to her computer and began working on another section of the image. She focused on William's face, using advanced software to bring out details that had been lost to time and degradation. The process took nearly an hour, adjusting light levels, contrast, and clarity, while being careful not to introduce artificial elements. As the image sharpened, she noticed something that made her pause and call Marcus over urgently. "Marcus, look at his eyes." The historian moved closer, adjusting his glasses. In the enhanced image, William's gaze was directed not at the camera, but slightly to the side, toward the carved symbol behind him. His expression held defiance and purpose. Marcus returned to Boston University and dove into his research with renewed energy, canceling classes and clearing his schedule to focus entirely on the Harrison family. He requested records from the Charleston Historical Society, the South Carolina Archives, and private collections that had been digitized over the years. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her restoration work, searching for any other hidden details in the photograph, examining every corner with fresh eyes and heightened awareness. 3 days later, Marcus called with news, his voice tight with excitement. He had found shipping manifests from William Harrison's textile business, and something didn't add up. While Harrison imported cotton and tobacco as expected, standard commodities for a Charleston merchant, there were irregularities in his records that became apparent only when examined closely. Shipments arrived at odd hours, often late at night when the docks would have been relatively empty. Cargo weights didn't match invoices, suggesting either incompetence or deliberate falsification. Most suspicious were frequent trips to Philadelphia and Boston that seemed excessive for a merchant of his size. Philadelphia and Boston were both major hubs of the abolitionist movement, Marcus explained over the phone, barely containing his excitement. "And I found something else. William had a business partner in Philadelphia named Thomas Chen, a Quaker merchant. The Quakers were deeply involved in the Underground Railroad, some of the most committed abolitionists in America." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Do we have any records of their correspondence?" "Not yet, but I'm checking with the Friends Historical Library in Philadelphia. If Thomas Chen saved any letters, they might be there. The Quakers were meticulous record keepers. It's one of the reasons we know as much as we do about Underground Railroad operations in Pennsylvania." While waiting for more information, Sarah decided to reach out to Rebecca Turner again. Perhaps there were other family documents, letters, or journals that had been overlooked in the estate sale. She called that evening, catching Rebecca just as she was finishing dinner. Rebecca was hesitant at first. She had already donated most of the papers to the Charleston Historical Society, but she remembered one item she had kept, a small leather diary that had been too damaged to read. "I almost threw it away," Rebecca admitted. "The pages are stuck together, and what I could see was mostly business notes. Numbers and dates, nothing interesting. I kept it because it seemed old, and I thought maybe someday someone would want it for historical purposes." Sarah asked her to send it immediately, explaining that damaged documents were her specialty, and that what looked like meaningless business records might contain coded information. In the Underground Railroad network, she explained, financial ledgers and shipping documents were often used to hide messages about escapes and safe houses, a practical cipher that would seem innocuous if discovered. The diary arrived 4 days later, carefully packaged in acid-free materials. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the box. The diary was in worse condition than Sarah had expected. Water damage, probably from decades of storage in a humid Charleston attic, had fused many of the pages together. The ink had faded in places or bled through the paper, creating palimpsests of overlapping text. The leather cover was cracked and brittle. She spent 2 full days carefully separating the pages using humidity chambers and specialized tools, working with the patience that conservation demanded and the urgency that the mystery inspired. The entries began in January 1858 and continued through November 1860, just weeks before South Carolina would secede from the Union. Most pages contained exactly what Rebecca had described: shipping dates, cargo quantities, prices, and payments. On the surface, it appeared to be a straightforward business ledger, the kind any merchant would maintain to track his commercial activities. But as Sarah transcribed the entries into a digital document, working late into the evenings at her home office, she noticed patterns that seemed unusual. Certain shipments were marked with small symbols in the margins, dots, dashes, and occasional stars similar to the one carved in the photograph's background. Some entries included names that appeared nowhere else in the business records, with notations like "departed north" or "received safely," followed by initials that might represent either people or places. Sarah photographed every page under specialized lighting that revealed faded ink and sent them to Marcus. Within hours, he called back, his voice barely controlled. "Sarah, I think we're looking at a record of escapes. Look at the entry from March 1859. 3 bales, departed north via TC, received safely in P. That's not cotton. That's 3 people who escaped via Thomas Chen and arrived safely in Philadelphia." They began cross-referencing the diary entries with known Underground Railroad activities and testimonies from formerly enslaved people who had escaped from South Carolina. Marcus had access to databases of testimony collected after the Civil War, when freedom allowed people to speak openly about their escapes. A pattern emerged with startling clarity. Every 2 to 3 months between 1858 and 1860, the diary recorded shipments that matched the timing and routes of successful escapes documented in other sources. Marcus found corroboration in a letter preserved at the Friends Historical Library. Thomas Chen had written to another Quaker abolitionist in 1859, mentioning "our friend in Charleston," who was doing remarkable work despite considerable personal danger. The letter never named William Harrison directly. Such caution was typical of Underground Railroad correspondence. But the timing and context aligned perfectly. He was using his legitimate business as cover, Marcus explained during one of their many phone conversations. Ships came and went from Charleston constantly. Textile imports required regular contact with northern ports. Who would notice a few extra passengers hidden in cargo holds or disguised as crew members? It was brilliant, actually, hiding in plain sight. As the investigation deepened, a troubling question emerged that neither Sarah nor Marcus could ignore. Did William's family know what he was doing? Sarah studied the photograph again, examining the faces of William's wife and children with new scrutiny and a growing sense that every element of this image had been carefully considered. Their expressions seemed carefully neutral, almost rehearsed, as if they had been coached to reveal nothing. The wife's hand rested on the eldest child's shoulder in what could be read as either protective or restraining, a gesture that held multiple meanings. Marcus found a census record from 1860 that listed the family members: William Harrison, age 43, his wife Elizabeth, age 38, and their children, Margaret, age 14, Samuel, age 11, and little Catherine, age 6. He also discovered something unexpected that changed their understanding entirely. Elizabeth had been born in Pennsylvania, in a Quaker community near Philadelphia. She had moved to Charleston only after her marriage to William in 1846. She would have grown up surrounded by abolitionist sentiment, Marcus noted during a meeting at the Restoration Center. The Quakers were among the most committed opponents of slavery in America. They ran schools, organized petition campaigns, and formed the backbone of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. It's hard to imagine she didn't know, perhaps even support, what William was doing. In fact, she may have been the catalyst for his involvement. Sarah enhanced the section of the photograph showing Elizabeth's face, using the same techniques that had revealed the book's initials. The woman's eyes, like her husband's, seemed to carry a weight beyond the formality of the portrait. There was determination there, and perhaps fear, but also something else, a quiet strength that suggested she was not merely a passive observer of her husband's dangerous work. Marcus located a letter from Elizabeth to her sister in Philadelphia, dated July 1860, preserved in a family collection that had been digitized years ago. No one had previously connected it to William Harrison's activities because the family name had changed through marriage in subsequent generations. Elizabeth wrote about the increasing tensions in Charleston, the growing hostility toward anyone suspected of Northern sympathies, and her concern for her children's safety in increasingly specific terms. "We must be more careful than ever," she had written in elegant script. "William's business requires such discretion, and I worry constantly that even a word spoken carelessly could bring disaster upon us all. The children understand the importance of silence, even Margaret, who asks questions I cannot fully answer. But we both know we cannot turn away from what conscience demands, no matter the cost to ourselves." The letter confirmed what they had suspected. Elizabeth was not just aware of her husband's activities, she was an active participant, helping to maintain the facade of a normal Charleston merchant family while they risked everything to help enslaved people escape to freedom. The photograph began to take on new meaning as a family portrait of conspirators. Marcus discovered a troubling gap in the diary entries that suggested mounting danger. From early November 1860 until the diary ended abruptly on November 28th, there were no shipment records, no coded notations about departures or arrivals. Instead, there were only anxious notes about political developments. Lincoln's election on November 6th, increasingly violent rhetoric about secession, talk of forming a new Southern nation, and growing violence in the streets of Charleston against anyone suspected of Union sympathies. The final entry was brief and chilling in its implications. "Too dangerous now, must protect E and the children. One last attempt. May God grant us success and forgiveness for what we risk." Sarah and Marcus knew that South Carolina had seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860, just 3 weeks after that final diary entry. Whatever William had attempted in late November would have been extraordinarily risky, carried out as the entire state moved toward rebellion and vigilance against suspected abolitionists reached its peak. Marcus searched through testimony records from formerly enslaved people, looking for anyone who had escaped from Charleston in November or December 1860. The work was painstaking, requiring him to read through hundreds of interviews conducted by abolitionists and Union officials during and after the Civil War. He found 3 accounts, 2 men and 1 woman who had separately reported receiving help from a merchant family in Charleston during the most dangerous time imaginable, when escape should have been impossible. One testimony, given by a man named Isaiah Bennett in 1863 to a Union officer in Philadelphia, was particularly detailed and emotionally powerful. He described being hidden in a warehouse near the Charleston docks for 3 terrifying days while militia groups searched for runaway slaves. He was fed and clothed by a woman who spoke with a northern accent, almost certainly Elizabeth, and then smuggled aboard a ship bound for Philadelphia in a crate marked as textile machinery. "The man who helped me, the one who owned the warehouse, he told me to remember his name," Isaiah had testified, his words preserved in fading ink. He said, "If you make it to freedom, tell them William Harrison helped you. Tell them there were good people in Charleston, even when darkness surrounded us." I thought he was crazy to tell me his real name, to risk everything like that, but I understood later. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted people to know that not everyone in Charleston supported the evil we lived under. I never forgot, and I'm telling you now, so it can be written down forever. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she read the testimony Marcus had found. William hadn't just helped people escape. He had wanted his actions remembered, his name connected to the cause of freedom, even if it meant potential danger to himself and his family in the short term. The daguerreotype, taken just weeks before that final dangerous act, was his proof, his testament, his message to the future. Marcus spent weeks tracking what happened to the Harrison family after 1860, following paper trails that had grown cold over more than a century and a half. The trail was fragmented. Records from the Civil War years were often incomplete, destroyed, or lost. But he slowly pieced together their story with the determination of someone who knew these forgotten lives mattered. William Harrison's business collapsed in early 1861, just weeks after South Carolina's secession. Whether this was due to the war's disruption of trade, suspicions about his loyalty, or both remained unclear. But by June 1861, the family had disappeared from Charleston records entirely. Marcus found a brief mention of them in Philadelphia Quaker records from 1862. William, Elizabeth, and their children had arrived in the city and were being assisted by the same community that Elizabeth had grown up in, returning to her roots after years in enemy territory. The family had fled with almost nothing, abandoning the warehouse, their home, and most of their possessions. They were refugees from the Confederacy, Southerners who had chosen conscience over country and paid the price. William died in 1864, according to a burial record Marcus located in a Philadelphia cemetery. The cause of death was listed as fever, though whether this was typhoid, yellow fever, or a euphemism for something else, perhaps wounds or injuries sustained during their escape, they couldn't determine. He was only 47 years old. Elizabeth survived him by 20 years, living quietly in Philadelphia and working with various charitable organizations that assisted freed people coming north after the war. The children's lives were easier to trace through census records, marriage certificates, and city directories. Margaret married a teacher and moved to Boston, where she became involved in education reform and founded a school for the children of freed people. Samuel became a minister and spent his career working with freed people in the South after the war, returning to the region his family had fled to help build new communities. Catherine, the youngest, became a nurse and worked in hospitals throughout the Northeast, caring for Civil War veterans and their families. None of them, as far as Marcus could discover, ever spoke publicly about their father's Underground Railroad activities. The secret had died with William and Elizabeth, buried under decades of silence and perhaps complicated shame. Charleston natives who had betrayed the Confederacy were not welcomed in post-war reconciliation narratives that emphasized healing rather than moral judgment. They lived through a time when their father's actions could still get them killed, Marcus explained to Sarah during one of their final meetings. Even after the war, former abolitionists in the South faced violence and ostracism. The family probably made a conscious decision to let the truth die with them, to protect their children and grandchildren from association with what the South still considered treason. Sarah looked at the restored daguerreotype, now brilliantly clear after weeks of painstaking work. But William didn't want it to die. He left this photograph, knowing someone might understand it someday. Sarah finished the restoration on a warm October afternoon, exactly 7 months after the daguerreotype had arrived at her center. The image was now pristine, every detail visible, every hidden element revealed and documented. She had created a comprehensive report explaining the restoration process, the discoveries made during enhancement, and the historical significance of each element. The Frederick Douglass book, the carved star symbol, the meaningful glances, the subtle positioning of the family members, everything was cataloged and interpreted. She and Marcus organized a presentation at the Boston Heritage Restoration Center, inviting historians, descendants of formerly enslaved people, members of the abolitionist history community, and representatives from several museums. Rebecca Turner flew up from Charleston, nervous and proud in equal measure, carrying with her the weight of a family history she had never known. The Restoration Center's main conference room filled with nearly 100 people, their anticipation palpable. When Sarah revealed the restored image on the large screen, the room fell silent. She explained each discovery methodically, showing the original damaged daguerreotype alongside the restored version, demonstrating how enhancement had revealed hidden details. She showed the diary entries and their decoded meanings, presented the testimonies from Isaiah Bennett and others who had been helped to freedom by the Harrison family. Marcus followed with the historical context, his voice carrying the authority of decades of research. He explained how rare it was to find documented evidence of Underground Railroad activity in the Deep South, how dangerous William Harrison's actions had been, and how the family had sacrificed everything for their convictions. He placed their story within the broader context of the abolitionist movement, showing how even in the heart of pro-slavery territory, there were individuals willing to risk everything for justice. Several descendants of formerly enslaved people spoke, their voices thick with emotion. One woman, whose great-great-grandfather had escaped from Charleston in 1859, possibly one of the shipments recorded in William's diary, wept as she looked at the photograph of the man who might have saved his life. "We always knew someone helped him," she said. "He told his children there was a white family in Charleston who risked everything, but we never knew their names, never knew what happened to them. Now we do. Now we can honor them properly." Rebecca Turner stood at the end, holding a copy of the restored daguerreotype, her hands trembling. "I never knew," she said softly, addressing the room. "My husband's family never told these stories. They were ashamed, I think, that their ancestor had sided against the South, had been what people called a traitor. But they shouldn't have been. They should have been proud. William Harrison was a hero, and now everyone will know it." The photograph was donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it now hangs in a prominent position alongside other artifacts of the Underground Railroad. The diary went to the Library of Congress, its coded entries finally understood and preserved for future researchers. Copies of both were also given to the Charleston Historical Society, where they represent a complicated but essential part of the city's history. Sarah returned to her workstation the next morning, ready for the next restoration project. But the image of William Harrison's face stayed with her, his determined eyes, his hand resting on that forbidden book, his silent message to the future. Some photographs, she knew now more than ever, were never just pictures. They were acts of witness, testaments to courage, bridges across time connecting past to present. And sometimes, if you looked closely enough and cared deeply enough, they revealed the secrets that people had been hiding, waiting patiently for someone to finally see the truth and bring it into the light where it belonged.